We are all open for answering questions.
So I think we wanted to convey something of the complexity that happens when you start to vary certain parameters of scale. Parameters of scale for the local languages, for the local cultures that you wish to reach. Parameters of optimizing on the fly for different authors. What happens when you actually try to deal with the user experience in kind of a systematic way, and why things aren't, and what actually happens when you think systematically about scale. Because that last query you saw is a bitch. You're really thinking about tracking, for every person, their own personalized set of experiences with an open-ended set of data types, all of which are flowing together. Once you start to aggregate the different pieces of research that get shown in a forum like this with Classicist, trying to make that all work together in a scalable system that you can manage starts to become much more complicated than that kind of problem that I, person like me, would work on. And as you can see, and so this is this new kind of collaborative space that we've got going. So you have many different forms of expertise.
Questions from you? Please.
Well, my name is Moritz from Universität. I have probably a ton of questions and comments and things about this, so we can try to contain myself. So I have one for Greg regarding syntax trees. You spoke very fondly of tree banking, and of course I'm a huge supporter of it myself.
Yeah.
I'd like to express maybe a concern or a question how you feel about this. I find syntax trees are very, very useful in understanding the structure of language, but what they don't capture is the understanding of meaning and usage. So one of the things I struggle with when teaching maybe linguists, languages with which they won't spend very many semesters, is that you can essentially create a tree bank of sentence without understanding a single word of it if you have a good grasp of the morphosyntax. And you'll never understand anything about language usage from that, because you won't know, is this an unusual way of saying what this person is saying? Why are they picking these words? These are all things that you won't get from the syntax tree. So maybe what's your view on that and how it interacts with the other modes of learning?
Well, I think, so one of the observations is that a colleague of mine did, and it's not a giant, N is not a giant number, but N was like 10 or 15, did some systematic studies of performance by our graduate students on the one hand, translation, turn the stuff into English, which is the one traditional metric, and on the other hand, what answered very specific questions about morphology and syntax. And in fact, what he discovered was there was a very high correlation. And as if you were really good at one, you were really good at the other. Now that's a correlation, that's not necessarily causality, but it suggests that in practice, I don't think we're going to get a lot of people who are like savants, able to do a tree bank and have no clue what's going on in the sentence. But I do think it is important, that's why the aligned translations are extremely useful, because I can tell you if you send someone through 20 instances of a word, they have a simple glossary entry or meaning for in their textbook, and they look at it in the text, they will know what that word means at a different level. Now these are two methods, but they provide a lot. They're going to provide everything? We'll see.
I mean, a second question, I have actually for, I think it was for Moritz.
Yep.
So about using graph databases. So in my group, we're also developing a search engine for linguistically annotated corpora, and we actually use a relational database to represent a graph structure. So first of all, I was wondering why it takes 30 tables to represent a relation. And second, I'd like to know how this thing ends up working if you're looking not so much for nodes that you start your search to traverse from, but for configurations. So in syntax tree banks, you often just look for a configuration of 3 nodes that are at a distance of depth of between 2 and 4, and one of them contains a really common category that doesn't help your index at all. Because we've looked at Neo4j and it ended up actually performing worse than RDBMS.
Okay, to the first question, we are kind of trying to figure out if it would meet our speed issues, because for now we just have a small data set and we are in the developing phase, so we could not even test really efficient our own queries. But for representing via a relational database, a graph, I think it's not up to it's kind of up to the format you get, because I cannot imagine, because the search queries and the implementation of the engines, I don't know if this would really work to use via a relational database. I mean, we are not very far already, and I also didn't implement the engine myself, but I think it's just about up to the implementation of the query engine.
I think that the sense that I get is that it's when you start to aggregate the morphosyntactic data, and then you add the named entity data, and then you add the alignment data, and then you add the profiles of every student who has a unique reading list, a unique set of experiences, and then their learning strengths. You start putting all these data structures together, it gets really hairy in traditional RDB, and so it's easier pragmatically to model this and then to run it in a graph database. It may, maybe it isn't, but we'll see. And I think that is the hypothesis that has been advanced, which seems reasonable to me on the.
How deep is your traversal depth, for example?
Essentially unlimited, because are you familiar with pre and post order trees?
Kind of.
So if you do a pre and post order arrangement of a graph and pre-index it, essentially finding ancestors and descendants basically reduces the finding a join on two numbers that must be smaller than large.
I think I would like to talk to you later as well. So thanks.
More questions?
Michael Henry, curriculio.org. Something, a kind of basic thing. I thought you were going to say that you were going to get a lot of texts that have never been tree-banked before, tree-banked by students, but then how do you know they're right? And then it sounded like some of it, is the elementary students going to be doing mostly things that have already been tree-banked and then told, sorry, you're wrong, that's not a nominative singular feminine, it's an accusative plural neuter, in old-fashioned terms. And more advanced students, you hope will get it right when they do something, or?
Well, I think that so first of all, one of the things we're working on is going back to more traditional terms, at least for people to see, as opposed to having to learn a dependency grammar. Mm-hmm. We have colleagues, and it's relatively, you could do a pretty good job of mapping into the dependency grammar if you want. You can start with a date of possession, or whatever it is. But I think the basic idea is you start with those words that have been analyzed. That's how you learn. And I'm a philologist, I don't believe in a single, there's always going to be someone arguing with you about the structure of something in the sentence. But we'll have a plausible answer for everything to start with, and I think pragmatically you have to let people do what I would call throw the challenge flag, or suggest a different way of interpreting the sentence. But ultimately, you say in the third semester, if not before, you could farm out a sentence to two individual students and have them independently work on it. Compare the results. We can measure the probability that if they both come up with the same answer, and we have some sense of how reliable they are from where they work, where we have a gold standard, you can call it that. We can have a pretty good sense of how probable they are correct when they agree. We can say, okay, you guys figure it out. You don't agree everywhere, you talk it over and see if you come up with a solution. And then at the end of class, we're going to go over it. And you will have questions, we'll talk about it. If we don't have an answer, we'll feed the questions out. Now, mind you, we have that opportunity, in theory, to work with people all over the place. Mm-hmm. You start with one class, you might have 5 sentences and 5 preliminary interpretations that can be revised, that can be published at the end of class. That's a delta that is not 0. But the real interesting exercise happens when you have people who do not share a common language, acting like they're playing World of Warcraft, where you have famous episodes. There was case studies of I speak Ukrainian, you speak Lithuanian, and all we know is we're stealing a jewel or something. And we use laughable Google Translate and we get the job done, which actually is happening right now. You have students working the same sentence, and one might be in Iran, one might be in Berlin, one might be Croatian. And their mission is to come up with a plausible analysis of the sentence that's never been analyzed before. They come up with something. As they do more and more work, as I say, we can model how confident they are that their statements will be plausible. The more they do, the more confident we will be in those models. And we can identify things that probably need more attention. And we can always update stuff. This is an open system. So we didn't talk about building, the distributed, such a distributed assessment module that's been done by our colleagues in the Perseus project in the Tufts branch of the Perseus office.
Do you allow, sorry.
No.
Do you allow two answers for one word?
Yeah. Well,
like puns, I'm thinking.
Well, there's my colleague Francesco Mandrini, who was who did the real work. So my linguist colleagues, excuse me, Amir, present company accepted, are just saying, give me one goddamn answer here. Just like go through, it's good enough. And they have a sense that they're running through usually typical language and it has an answer they're happy with. Philologists fight about everything. So of course, we have to think, so Francesco working on Aeschylus early on thought about how we would deal with multiple interpretations. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Multiple interpretations about treebank, that is still an open issue. I mean, we have thought about that. We still don't know exactly how to end this. But one possible option is to integrate, that I'm particularly fond of, is integrating this kind of linguistic annotation in other tools like Perseid, the environment that are currently under development. And let's create, and then creating infrastructure to argue about, to defend one interpretation, to bring arguments about the kind of reading that has been done. But at the present, the current status of the ancient Greek and Latin dependency treebank, we do allow multiple interpretation of multiple and different annotations of the same text. For example, we have two Antigonies in the treebank.
No, I was thinking there's a difference between, we can't tell that whether this is similar of or similar to because they're both good Latin, and if it's first declension, who can tell?
Exactly.
Data. And then the entirely different thing where, like, the second to last word of the chorus is Pyrrha ode, is it the god who has power over the sea or the god who has power over the male? And I think most people think that's a pun, and it is very clearly parsable, and you can treebank it, you just have to do it two different ways.
That's an interesting ontological. So their ontology need to represent the fact this is supposed to have two meanings.
Yes, as opposed to the other one where probably whoever wrote it, you can look and see when he uses symbolist, does he mostly use it with the genitive or mostly with the dative, or maybe consistently, in which case, but if he's a little swishy about whether it's genitive or dative in other places, you may not be able to tell, but who cares, as opposed to a pun where they're both important. Sure. But, hey, okay, but you can handle that.
Unfortunately, this, for example, is not something that fits very well into a tag of a treebank. So we should probably find ways, yes, to integrate more.
I think in pragmatic terms, this is why a bunch of isolated RDF statements are really useful. Because if you have a treebank that has an analysis for every single word, and you want someone else's treebank should be represented as a bunch of diffs, alternate analyses, maybe not necessarily an entirely new treebank, but here are the places where I differ, so that you would be able to convert one to the other. Now, you raise an interesting challenge. You have to be able to identify, this is a different way of proposing a single interpretation, as opposed to saying these two interpretations, as in a pun, are both valid at the same time. That's why the Marx Brothers are funny.
Maxime Coupret from Egyptology. I'm writing my PhD in Egyptology. The question is, this is totally new topic for me, so it's probably too simple, but do you create all the software from bottom up? Do you program it, or do you have already something, for example, for this syntax what do you call it, syntax trees. Do you have something already available that makes it? This is the first question. The second is, there was the question if syntax trees really help us to understand the language. For example, in Egyptian, we still know that in Sumerian also we still have debates about is it like what is the real structure of the sentence? Where is it a subject or is it and a predicate? So how can this system work for the languages where these trees are not yet stable, like not yet, there is no consensus about the roles, syntactic roles. First, and one more question which applies also to Egyptology. You were talking about the alphabetic languages which have alphabet, like alphabetic. Does it apply to languages, hieroglyphic languages? And how is it actually working? I'm sure that there are projects like this for Chinese and for Japanese. But how is it working for languages like Egyptian, where we have also consonants, but we also have determinatives, and there are no kind of separation between words. We don't know where the sentence stops and ends, and how could this, to see any way how this could all be applied for Egyptian language, because we have also a wonderful TLA dictionary and Egyptian notebook, and yeah.
And last answer question first. I think there's an article that I have read quickly, because I don't know ancient Egyptian, about applying what Leipzig glossing rules to ancient Egyptian. So they thought about how would you represent this. Amir probably speak to this, even more of a Coptic guy. But I think that there are people who have thought about it as the answer, the short answer, and their strategies for it. The first question, are there various technologies that exist? The answer is yes, they're never good enough. We always want to replace them. Part of the threat is you have a technology that may work in a small scale, and then if you ramp it up from 1,000 words or 100,000 words to 1,000,000 words, 10 times bigger makes it 100 times slower. Or it cannot be generalized to Egyptian. For whatever reason, it has assumptions built into it about the nature of the language. So a lot of work exists. Whether it's directly applicable to what you want would require a conversation with a mirror if I was you. And what was the second question again?
May I speak to the second question?
Yeah.
About the second question, I'm Stella D. I, like Maryam, was hired partly because I don't know ancient Greek, and I'm another test learner here. And I would say that some of the most that yes, tree banking absolutely helps. I do have experience in a number of other languages in classrooms, and just we spent some time learning tree banking from Francesco and also from Giuseppe Celano, who's not here today. But part of what excites me about these kinds of materials is their utility as a classroom tool. And I would say because a lot of the most helpful conversations come up when you're discussing exactly those sorts of open questions. You were talking about Egyptian, where the morphology and syntax is not in fact certain, and it's the discussion that helps you to understand even more so than whatever final tree bank you settle on. And so I would say not only it definitely helps as a methodology to understand ancient Greek, but it also I would recommend that you would have to try this to be certain, but I would anticipate that it's immensely helpful for languages where all that is not fixed.
Yeah, you referred to Coptic, but Coptic is again an alphabetic language.
I tried to answer that from, so Greg was alluding to me with the Coptic, about talking about Coptic in one of the case. So it's true that Coptic doesn't have the layouting challenges of Egyptian, but you could pretty much say that's a separate issue, because once you have even a Gardner code plus some sort of Egyptian layouting encoding going on, you could write some module that would visualize it. That's a separate issue that's probably not really related to the tree banks problem. It's a meta level About the tree banking and syntax, I'd like to say generally what's nice about corpora and about doing annotation schemes is that it's not about knowing the truth. You don't need to know for a fact what the subject of an Egyptian sentence is. It's about putting your money where your mouth is. It's about making a decision about every sentence, about every word of text that you have, and applying your annotation scheme to it. If there are sentences that are so messed up and fragmentary and deficient that you can't assign all the categories, even for Greek, then what your schema needs is something like an ambiguity category, a category that says subject or object, a category that says I don't know, in the hopes that you can look for it later. And I think for ancient Egyptian, there are several projects that I'm aware of, at least in Liège, and the Ramses project in Liège, and the TLA is planning a Morphosyntactic annotated corpus of Egyptian. So I think for a lot of Egyptian, you could definitely apply tree banking to it. And if that means that your schema needs to have a dependency relation called this is my classifier, then that's fine. Nobody's telling you that you have to have the exact same categories as in the Prague Dependency Treebank. They're just telling you have a set of categories, make it closed, be sure about the categories you want to have, and apply them to every text that you have in a consistent way. And if you find out that's not enough because you have a problem, well then revise your guidelines and go over it again. But that's the challenge. That's exactly what the promise is of using tree banks in this implementation.
Great. I would suggest we move to the mic and let's thank again our speakers.